Chapter 6, Ethics and Privacy. This has gotten more and more focus in recent years. In fact, in previous editions of this textbook, this was wrapped into actually Chapter 7. But the ethics around business in general has gotten so much more focus. Uh, Business ethics and individual and personal privacy has become some of the most important issues in the global and business environment that we have today. Now, to start a discussion with a high-level outline of ethical frameworks. Now, this is by no means a comprehensive dive into all ethical constructs, but hits some of the more common selections that can impact us in management information science. Now, the utilitarian approach states that an ethical action is one that provides the most good or does the least harm. This approach is often associated with economic decision-making. Essentially, you add up all the benefits of a course of action and offset them against the costs of that action. If the action nets set to a positive overall, then it is taken or an accepted action. Now, criticism of this action is that it can leave a lot of harm in its wake. This is kind of from a Star Trek's Mr. Spock, if some of you remember from his famous needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few quote. The utilitarian approach is great as long as you are always one of the many and not one of the few. Now, the rights approach maintains that an ethical action is the one that best protects and respects the moral rights of affected parties. Now, this again has some issues. It sounds good on the surface, but can get mired down in debates about exactly what rights individuals are entitled to and what happens when an individual's right potentially can interfere with another person's rights. A fairness approach suggests that ethical actions treat all human beings equally, or if unequally, then fairly, based on some defensible standard. As with the previous two approaches, there are some issues to deal with here. The text gives the example of executive pay in relation to their employees' pay as an example. Exactly how we determine what is fair becomes the issue of debate on this. Now, a common good approach highlights the underlying interlocking relationships that all societies supposedly share. Respect and compassion for all others is the basis for ethical actions to create those conditions to the importance to the welfare of everyone. The text gives examples of this, such as community laws, public health, safety organizations, and the like. Now, they break these four frameworks we just talked about into 5 steps of how we approach a comprehensive ethical framework and decide what to do. First, we recognize an ethical issue. Could this decision or situation damage someone or some group or entity? Does this decision involve a choice between a good and a bad behavior? Does it involve more than simply legal considerations? If so, what are they? Then we sort of say, get the facts, and what are the relevant facts of the situation? Do we have sufficient information to make a decision? What individuals or groups have an important stake in the outcome? And you hear the term stakeholders used over and over. And have we consulted all the relevant persons and groups? Do we have all the stakeholders we need for getting factual assessments? And then you evaluate alternative actions. Which option will produce the most good or do the least harm? That utilitarian approach we talked about. Which option best respects the rights of all stakeholders, i.e. the rights approach we talked about in the previous slide. Which option treats people equally or proportionally, the fairness approach again. Which option best serves the community as a whole and not just some of the members, the sort of common good approach. So these steps of general ethical frameworks tries to incorporate all those aspects that we said before. So then we make a decision and test it. We consider all the approaches and which option best addresses whatever situation we have. And then we sort of act and reflect on the outcome of any decision that's made. How can I implement my decision with the greatest care and attention to the concerns of all stakeholders? How do I make my decision? How did my decision turn out when I made it? What did I learn from this specific situation? And you might recognize that this set of ethical framework criteria have some very significant similarities to the manager decision-making framework from the previous chapter. No coincidence there. Now then, most corporations have a code of ethics today. Acquiring a code of ethics over the past 2 decades has been described as what getting a mission statement was in the 1980s. Everyone gets one, but to what degree it impacts an organizational enterprise's actions is not always clear. The corporate scandals of Enron and WorldCom 20 years ago brought organizational ethics to the forefront of business operations. Having a core collection of principles to guide decision-making of an organization's member is now considered essential. The tenets of these principles have different core elements. When we speak of responsibility, we generally mean to accept consequences of an organization's actions and decisions. Accountability refers to determining responsibility for the actions. This is not necessarily from a punitive or punishing standpoint, but may simply lead to education, training, or understanding for the accountable parties. Liability is largely a legal concept that gives individuals the right to recover damages done to them by other individuals, organizations, or systems. Basically, it involves the assertion that wrongs will be righted to the extent possible. Now, many people today are shocked to be reminded that an organization such as Nike was in danger of failing in the 1990s due to concerns of ethical labor practices in developing countries. Now, Nike met this challenge with a comprehensive plan of implementing an ethical culture that today is considered one of the most exemplary examples of ethical corporate governance in the business world, and Nike is stronger than ever. Studies have suggested that a consumer will forgive inappropriate actions of responsibility if those actions are responsibly and the liability are correctly addressed. So consumers today will forgive depending on an unethical issue or something that they've done wrong if the company steps up to the plate in terms of responsibility, accountability, and liability. Now, information technology is fraught with ethical landmines. Privacy issues involve how information is collected, stored, and disseminated about each and every one of us. Accuracy concerns the authenticity and truthfulness and correctness of information. And property involves ownership issues of information and any value that may derive from that information. In the early 1990s, there was much debate about the ability to copyright a web page or who owns information posted on the internet. These are things that today we take for granted, but were very much debated a generation ago. Now, accessibility refers to who can or who should have access to information and how. If we accept that there is no value to information, then the property issues are even, or excuse me, if we accept that there is value to information, then the property issues are even more acute, because if there's value to something, who owns that has some real issues that they need to be accountable for. Now, let's take a little deeper dive into some parts of these issues. Now, 6.2 in the book lists just a few of the issues of privacy that concern businesses and each of us as individuals. As you look through this list, think of how each of them impacts yourself or your employer. Now, the text talks about 2 privacy rules that are salient. This slide points out an important element in the privacy debate. When the text points out that all states recognize that there is a right to privacy, it does have a number of limitations. Courts have said that this right to privacy is not absolute. Societal needs can trump individual rights to privacy. Consider this in the context of the ethical frameworks we were talking about earlier. Second, The public's right to know can supersede an individual's right to privacy more directly. Now, the sheer volume of data being collected on each of us on a daily basis is massive. This amassing of data is a valuable tool for organizations as they create digital dossiers and profiles on us for marketing, political, and security purposes. Now, electronic surveillance is a bigger and bigger issue. Concerns over the level of electronic surveillance is repeatedly being raised by entities such as the ACLU and other privacy advocates and watchdogs. In London, they say, is the most videotaped city on the planet, and it's been a great benefit from a law enforcement standpoint, but there's a huge loss of privacy. But they are willing, in England at least, to take the benefits of public safety over the privacy restrictions that we might take for granted. Does someone really know I'm shopping at Nordstrom Rack today? But that's the trade-off. Now, your smartphone is a great multi-purpose tool, as we talked about in earlier chapters, but it also provides information about you and your activities to extreme levels. If everyone's used map programs that help us get around the streets more easily, but when they eliminate traffic congestion, it is through the tracking the number of individuals with smartphones that are ahead of you in traffic and going slowly, and seeing where they're going and how fast. So smartphones can listen even to the television programs we're watching to gain better information about our consumer preferences. It knows when you're changing channels, it knows what ads you're listening to, and in some cases it can tell whether you've turned the volume up or down because you care about something on TV. And facial recognition software, which goes along with those discussions about London being such a highly photographed city, this allows the identification of consumers and customization of resulting marketing efforts, but also is a law enforcement issue. In London, it is regularly used by the police to identify, locate, and apprehend criminal suspects. To what extent our freedoms in this country will allow that to happen over the long term is still greatly being debated. Now, the issues listed on this slide offer just a few of the concerns on the collection and retention of data. Many of us have experienced or know someone who has experienced the impact of bad or incorrect information on a traditional old-fashioned credit report. Inaccurate negative information can be devastating to an individual on a credit report. Now think of the massive amounts of differing demographic and personal information that is being collected about us, and when it is being utilized or misused. Given the dispersion of this data, it can be almost impossible to correct inaccurate information or harmful data sets that are stored throughout the world. This comes up all the time in prospective employers because it's not illegal for your employer to Google you or look up your Facebook page and see anything that might be negatively impacted about you, right or wrong. Now, use the example of a student sending an email to a second student. Pose the question, how many digital copies of that email are there? Suppose students often respond, 2. That's not true. There are infinite copies of those throughout different servers all over the place. There's information everywhere. Just knowing who to contact to get inaccurate information corrected can be a logistical nightmare when you consider all the data points and touch points throughout the world. Now, organizations should set up a formal set of codes and policies to govern the protection of information from its customers, clients, and employees. Now, these policies are generally, but not always, available to the public. And they often fall into either an opt-in or an opt-out model. Opt-in models generally prohibit the collection of data unless the customer specifically gives consent to organizations to collect the data. Analogously, opt-out models give the customer the option to prohibit the collection of data, but without that option being exercised by the customer, the company will collect the data as it can and will within the law. And sadly, most of us give consent to data collection on an ongoing basis when we click the agree button on a software load, online purchase, or other similar electronic transactions. We do it all the time. Table 6.2 from the text gives an example of our corporate privacy policy. Now we'll deal with the data confidentiality section in greater detail in the next chapter. But this is a fairly simple one, but it does outline some of the issues we've been talking about in this chapter and how the company decides to address it. Now, the global nature of electronic communication and data collection make for huge potential disparities of laws and business practices. Remember back to the privacy codes and policies slide a couple of slides ago. Now, sadly, many countries have no laws concerning data confidentiality and treatment, making the management information science world sort of a Wild West frontier in many respects. It's difficult even to ascertain governing jurisdictions at any given data collection event. Does the organization whose corporate headquarters is in for a given country govern the laws? What if they have a subsidiary elsewhere in the world? How does law enforcement determine their jurisdiction, given the borderless nature of the internet? Some countries and government organizations, such as the ECC, are trying to establish viable controls for data transfer and utilization, but it remains a daunting challenge. And I think the book credits about 50 countries having some very cohesive laws, but that's a sad minority of all the government organizations on the planet. So organizations have become dependent on their IT staffing to support strategic direction of the organization. Now, virtually all professions, law, medicine, accountants, and many others, have established codes of professional standards. Currently, several IT-related professional organizations have issued their own code of ethics, but few, if any, are currently enforceable under the law. It's likely going to take a few more years for a general code of ethics to be adopted by the IT profession. It may take even longer for certification and other measures to be mandated by law, like they are for lawyers, doctors, and teachers. Until these measures are in place, it is incumbent on IT professionals, each and every one of us, to think and act ethically about the many issues that are discussed in this chapter.